In less than a week, BC is choosing its next provincial government. Actually, the election has already started. Advance voting was this weekend, and many of you probably chose to get mail-in ballots because, of course, the COVID pandemic. For that same reason, the BC government, under John Horgan and the NDP, have decided to hold its election 1 year early. Whether or not you think that's a good idea, I'll leave up to you, but like it or not, the election is here. So let's take a look at the major parties taking on our biggest issues, the leaders of those parties, and the policies they have and will implement to do so. The three parties we're going to focus on are the current NDP government, the current opposition Liberals under Andrew Wilkinson, and the Greens under their new leader, Sonia Furstenau. These parties are all running in the majority of the province's 78 ridings, and of course, we only get one vote for one party representative in the one electoral district we live in. So these parties just are important because they're an option for most voters. There are a few other minor parties too, but none of these parties are running in most ridings, and they're unlikely to win more than one seat anyway, if any. So realistically, if any of these candidates do win a seat, they'll be more like an independent MLA, bound only by their personal principles. So I encourage you to look into the specific candidates these minor parties are running in your riding, and who knows, maybe you'll fall in love. But otherwise, voting for these parties is more or less a protest vote. So let's go back to the big guys. You might be familiar with these party names from federal politics, but you should be careful about drawing direct comparisons. All three parties actually play a very different role in BC than they do federally. Like most things, it's easiest to understand this with a little history. So let's go back to the beginning. No, not that beginning. Nope, not that one, not even that one. I'm talking 1903. BC had been part of Canada for about 3 decades now, but until we got our 16th premier, Conservative Richard McBride, we didn't really have a party system. Skip ahead a few years and we'll find another party, a Liberal Party, in power. At this time, these parties were more like the federal parties that we think of today with these names. The Liberals were center-left, the Conservatives center-right, and they were more or less both committed to the same principles of liberal democracy. But today, our Liberal Party is actually the more conservative right-wing party, and the Conservatives are minor players at best. So, what happened? Well, for one, our Conservative government botched the response to the Great Depression. We had the highest unemployment rates in the country. This failure temporarily fractured the party into 2 factions with 2 leaders and also allowed a labor-focused Social Democratic Party to gain a lot of steam, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, which will eventually become the NDP. Unsurprisingly, the Conservatives were destroyed in this election, and the CCF rose to become the official opposition to the new Liberal Party government. Skip ahead a few years, and the CCF actually wins more votes than either the Liberals or the Conservatives. It was at this point that the 2 Liberal Democratic parties realized something. They had more in common with each other than they differed, and they differed a whole lot from the Social Democratic CCF. And together, they had 2/3 of the vote and could easily beat them. So they did just that, created a coalition, and won the next election handily. But it didn't take long for this partnership to fall apart, and they redivided. But, to avoid splitting the vote, they made the cynical decision to use a ranked ballot system for the next election. They thought anyone who voted Liberal first would vote Conservative second, and vice versa. And as a result, the CCF could be shut out. But surprise, nope. A new party, the Social Credit Party, actually won the most seats. Actually, they didn't even expect to win and didn't even have a leader at the time. Although, the man they'd choose, W.A.C. Bennett, would eventually become the longest-serving premier in the province's history. And there's a reason he was so successful. The centrist Liberal Democratic parties learnt something. Together, they win. Divided, they fall. And so the old Liberal and Conservative parties faded away. And every election since then, the vaguely right-wing faction of BC politics rallies around a single party. Sometimes this group is called the Free Enterprise Coalition. For a long time, this was the Socreds, and when that branding tired out, the coalition shifted to the BC Liberals brand. Which is why the BC Liberals are so different from the centre-left federal Liberals. These historical lessons forged a big tent, centrist coalition with a vaguely conservative leaning and a broad support base. The NDP, on the other hand, struggled for a long time to build out a left-wing counterpart to the Free Enterprise Coalition. Sure, they're the biggest left-leaning party competing against a right-wing government, but for a long time they just weren't the same. They were still a lot like their federal counterpart that we're familiar with today, a principled leftist party, and that's fine, but to really compete, they needed to become a big tent, centrist coalition party like their rivals. Which is why today, the BC NDP are a much more centrist, pragmatic party than the federal NDP. I'd say our provincial parties overlap with the federal parties like this. Left-leaning federal Liberals would probably join the BC NDP, and the more business-oriented Liberals would join the BC Liberals. Most Conservatives would join the BC Liberals too, and most NDP would join the BC NDP. But anyway, unlike the Free Enterprise Coalition that learnt these lessons in the middle of the century, the BC NDP really only started to come into their own in more recent decades. Not including Horgan, they've had 5 premiers, but only 3 of those have ever won elections, and none of them have won re-election. Horgan, of course, hopes to change that, and it's really clear that he has learned his lessons from history. He got his start in government in the 90s, working as a policy advisor under the second NDP government. After not 1, but 2 of these NDP premiers resigned following financing scandals, Horgan even became the chief of staff of interim leader and premier Dan Miller. Along with these scandals, he saw the NDP brand really sour in the public mind. They rushed too quickly into major changes, they suffered controversies about people exploiting the welfare system, and they gained a reputation as inept financial managers. If you've been in BC long enough, you might remember the expensive Fast Ferries project, which, because of the wake the ferries would make at faster speeds, ended up being an entire waste. And this was really symbolic of the government at the time. In short, they earned that reputation as fanciful, unthoughtful, poor governors. And in 2001, after 4 leaders in just 10 years, they lost 77 out of 79 seats to Gordon Campbell's Liberals. I think it's fair to say that this had a major effect on the way young bureaucrat Horgan saw politics. He didn't abandon the NDP. Supposedly the reason he ran for and won his Greater Victoria seat at all was because one day he found himself yelling at the BC Liberals on the TV, and one of his kids' friends went, "So why don't you do better?" And of course he chose to do so, and chose to do so by running with the NDP. But he did abandon the party's older methods. Horgan has been a real moderating force on his government. Maybe it's because of his background as an advisor, but he's really run his government less as a charismatic media leader trying to win a mandate for his grand ambitions, and more like a pragmatic manager. He's quick to give his cabinet ministers the lead. He's completely left the pandemic messaging to Bonnie Henry and Health Minister Adrian Dix, for example, has been very careful in rolling out new programs. He campaigned pretty hard in 2017 for $10 a day daycare, for example, but has chosen to roll that out through a slow series of pilot projects, and is very wary to wade into major political debates. During the referendum on electoral reform, for example, he seemed quite happy to leave things be and avoided a controversial campaign. #ProRep is lit. And most of all, he's focused on appearing financially responsible. Speaking of the 2017 campaign, you may remember that the outcome was quite uncertain. The Liberals had been in power for 16 years at that point, and, like most governments at that age, had really started to collect a lot of baggage. But in a lot of ways, the governments of Campbell and Clark were masterclasses in the Free Enterprise Coalition concept. They had lots of conservative policies. They liked cutting taxes, giving rebates, selling off public companies like BC Rail. But they also did a good job at appealing to lots of classes of people. They liked wearing hard hats and campaigning for jobs, 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 and Usually that meant a lot of big government spending in infrastructure projects and the like. As moderates, they also did some things that today would be considered quite left-leaning, like introducing North America's first carbon tax. But as time went on, they were seen as more and more detached, dismissive, pompous even. They were always embroiled in one labor dispute or another, cutting health worker pay and privatizing some healthcare services, forcing teachers back to work on multiple occasions, cutting school funding, and expanding classroom sizes. And, of course, the housing crisis that continues today really started taking root under the Liberals. And at the same time, they were perceived as a little apathetic to the problem. They did a lot of good, but after 16 years, a lot of the bad they did was catching up with them. And so, in 2017, they failed to secure a majority, winning just one seat short of the halfway 44-seat mark. The NDP basically won the same popular vote, but came out to 41 seats, and the Greens won 3 seats. If the Liberals wanted to stay in power, or if the NDP wanted to take power, they'd need the Greens' support. The Green Party, for their part, was the new kid on the block. Former leader Andrew Weaver had won the party's first seat in the previous election at the beginning of a nationwide little tidal wave of Green successes that continues to this day. Because he was the party's only MLA, he was quite independent and free to define the party for himself. So in 2017, the Greens were somewhat politically in the middle of the NDP and Liberals, well summarized by Weaver's pet campaign phrase, "good public policy." This strategy worked out pretty well, and the Greens were able to win 2 more seats, including one in Cowichan Valley, where the Greens' new leader, Sonia Furstenau, won. And her win turns out to be pretty important here. Furstenau, like John Horgan actually, has a master's degree in history, and before getting her start in politics as a regional district representative, she worked as a high school teacher. And supposedly, as a teacher, she wasn't incredibly fond of how Christy Clark and the Liberals had managed their education portfolio. Plus, dispositionally, I think she's also a lot more left-leaning than Andrew Weaver. Under her leadership, I'd say the BC Greens are the province's new leftist party, taking on the role that the federal NDP usually plays. So, just to keep things confusing, the BC Greens are kind of like the federal NDP. The BC NDP are kind of like the federal Liberals, and the BC Liberals are kind of like the moderate federal Conservative Party. So that's fun. Anyway, Furstenau's reported disdain for the Liberal government, as well as the mutual bromance that Horgan and Weaver developed at a rugby game that summer, resulted in the Greens throwing their weight behind the NDP. And so, Horgan, not Clark, became Premier. Clark pretty quickly resigned. It's important to note that the agreement the Green DP, as they became known as, came to was not a coalition. It was a simple agreement that the Greens would not go against the NDP on important votes like the budget and force an early election, which is ironic given that's exactly what Horgan's doing right now. In return, the NDP would focus more on some key Green issues, and the Greens would have a more involved and important role in legislation. Interestingly, this probably makes Furstenau the most experienced and capable governor out of any Green politician in the country. Not that that says much. But anyway, the Greens still voted against the NDP as much as they voted with them. The LNG pipeline, for example, was passed with NDP and Liberal support and Green opposition. So just be careful not to think of this as an NDP and Green government. It was an NDP government with Green support. Speaking of the Liberals, after some drama about who would become the Speaker of the Legislature and a Liberal leadership race, we can finally introduce Andrew Wilkinson, who looks pretty impressive on paper. He was born in Australia but grew up in Kamloops, became a doctor, and worked as a physician in small communities all across the province, and then became a lawyer working in Vancouver. And then, as lawyers are wont to do, he ran to become an MLA in 2013 and won his seat at the same time as Andrew Weaver. He eventually served under Clark as the Attorney General, which is like the Minister of Law and Justice, before the party lost in 2017. So the Liberals run their leadership race with a multi-round ranked ballot system, so just winning the most votes isn't enough to actually win. You need 50% or more. In the first round, Andrew Wilkinson actually placed in third, and it wasn't until the 5th round that he narrowly beat out former Surrey Mayor Diane Watts, who was an NDP for the federal Conservatives at the time. What I'm getting at here is that from these results, we can glean that Wilkinson, like Horgan, is not some uber charismatic leader or anything. He was a safe, moderate bet that no one loved or had any major problems with, and was selected to lead a slow transition into a new era for the party. So let's take a look at the platforms to see what that means. We'll jump right into it with the big one, COVID. So I'm sure you're aware of the general gist. Lots of industries have shut down, lots of people are working from home, most of us are wearing masks whenever we go out, most of us. And now the province is starting to ramp back into things. Businesses have been reopening with some strict spacing protocols, and schools too. If you don't like any of that, I'm sorry to tell you that all three parties plan to carry on with these policies. In BC, there's an agreement that priority number one is people's health, and the only way to get the economy back in order isn't to prolong the problem and ignore the health dynamic, but to make sure everyone's safe, so we can bring confidence back into the economy in an orderly way. Where the parties differ is on their recovery plans. In terms of the economy, all parties think that drastic times call for drastic measures, and plan on running budget deficits and building debt over the next 4 years. The NDP and Greens plan on doing this by sending money to individuals and families, while the Liberals, as the Free Enterprise Coalition we talked about, are much more focused on putting money into projects to get the economy going. Specifically, the NDP followed suit with the federal government and gave out a one-time $1,000 benefit to anyone who had lost work. This was a stopgap measure, as hundreds of thousands of people were suddenly out of work. And now, they plan on giving another $1,000 to families after the election. The Green Party wants to go even further and use this opportunity to slowly phase in a guaranteed basic income program for people with lower incomes. Now, this isn't a universal income plan, so even though it sounds really expensive, it is possible that this program could eventually replace other welfare programs and end up saving money in the long run. Realistically though, the Greens probably won't have enough seats to implement something this big. And I also know that to a lot of you, the idea of just handing out cash isn't very appealing. So instead of sending checks to individuals, the Liberal plan is to invest nearly $40 billion over 5 years into infrastructure projects like transportation, hospitals, and housing. The other parties are also doing this, plus their other programs. The idea, though, is that these projects will create jobs and in turn allow for more future economic activity. This sort of planned debt is actually really similar to the program that Trudeau ran on in 2015, although for very different reasons. The Liberals will also cut provincial sales taxes to 0% for the next year, and then instead of returning it to 7% thereafter, will only bring it back up to 3%. Now, there's definitely some trade-offs here. As a more conservative party, the Liberals generally don't like high taxes. Less sales taxes means a lot of purchases will be more affordable, especially for people with lower incomes who need to spend most of their income rather than putting it into savings. At the same time, though, it means cutting the revenue that the government has at hand, which means less services and welfare programs during the recovery, or when covered with the debt that all three parties plan to take on, could start feeling a little risky. So, whose checkbook do you care about more? Yours, in the short to medium term, or the government's, in the long term? Moving on to businesses, all three parties plan on helping with lease and rent payments while cash flows remain low, and they're all especially worried about supporting the tourism and hospitality sectors. In terms of COVID healthcare changes, all parties are again on the same page. They all support making the eventual vaccine free for everyone, and the Liberals even plan on making seasonal flu vaccines free. Plus, in response to our quarantine circumstances, the NDP and Liberals want to expand the amount of services available over phone and online. Further, the Liberals want to make online prescription renewals easier, and even want to create a home delivery service, which is nifty. Speaking of prescriptions, the NDP and Greens want to work with the federal government to create a national pharmacare program so we can roll prescriptions into our universal healthcare system. The Greens would even create a provincial program to at least cover essential drugs. in terms of healthcare generally, the NDP have actually been really successful in cutting down wait time since 2017. They're also currently in the process of building or upgrading 14 new hospitals, especially in rural areas where some healthcare needs can often be far away. The Liberals want to play around with this around the edges a bit, including more ambulances and faster response times for rural areas, but otherwise plan on continuing this practice. And all three parties want to get more doctors in the province. Senior care is obviously on a lot of people's minds. Not only are our elders more vulnerable to COVID, but lots of our earliest and most serious outbreaks have been in care homes. And again, all parties are more or less on the same page here. They all want to invest lots of money in creating more homes and care centers for our aging population, and to allow for more care to be done from people's homes, including daily living services like dressing, bathing, and meal prep. As our demographics shift, this will probably be crucial. Where they differ is on how to deliver those services. You see, the previous Liberal government privatized a lot of these services and shifted the employment of care workers to something like service industry shifts. This ended up having a few weird effects where some care workers would have to work at multiple facilities in the same week and would end up getting different wages for the same work depending on which location they were at. More importantly for our story here, it's this sort of multi-facility work that was a major contributor to COVID spreading in care homes. And so, the NDP, of course, blame the Liberals for these problems. And they favor returning to a public model, so we can standardize care and wages and better keep an eye on things like this in the future. The Greens are on board with this too, although they're fine with private, non-profit, or co-op care centers. The Liberals, however, disagree. They still think that privatization is more efficient and allows the government to work more on other things. They'll still invest in care homes, including a $7,000 tax rebate for home care, which I guess is helpful if you're already paying that much in taxes, but they believe the problem we're facing here can just as easily be solved by regulating the private system. And so, they'll leave it private. So this is a pretty classic left-wing versus right-wing debate, and I bet most of you have a gut feeling about private versus public systems. So, I'll leave it there. Another interesting policy from the NDP is a Silver Alert program, which is a hilarious name for an Amber Alert program for seniors with conditions like dementia. I don't know who would want to argue against this, so I won't try. Let's move on to a different kind of healthcare now. Mental health and the opioid crisis, which will bleed into a conversation about police and housing. And once again, all three parties are more or less in agreement. I was quite happy to see that every party supports putting a dedicated psychiatric nurse or therapist in every high school, which just seems to me like a no-brainer, proactive step to snip a lot of ailments in the bud and save everyone trouble down the road. Every party also wants to increase the access to mental health care generally, and work on building and supporting new centers. The NDP even wants to reopen facilities like Riverview and Coquitlam. I know a lot of, like Riverview in Coquitlam, which I know a lot of people cite its closing as sort of the cause of our current homelessness and vagrancy crisis. I'll let you be the judge of that. The NDP and Greens will also work on creating more proactive outreach programs to try and reach people who just aren't capable of seeking help themselves, most of whom are the sort of people who are suffering and causing problems on the streets right now. So this proactive approach could be really beneficial long term. But right here is where we hit a major divide in the parties. The NDP and Greens are big proponents of what's called harm reduction when it comes to drug use and visible homelessness. So we all agree that hard drug use is bad in some way, but the goal with these programs is to reduce the negative outcomes, rather than to punish the behavior and make these people's lives even worse. So these are programs like safe injection sites and plans like decriminalizing drug possession, or to at least stop policing it. The NDP even ran this pretty successful PSA campaign, which pivoted from these scary anti-drug ads of the previous Liberal government to empathy-building ones like these. And the evidence is in favor of these policies. Harm reduction does increase the life expectancy and even recovery rate for addicts. It helps these British Columbians go on to lead full lives. And the NDP have led a really big push here. But there are downsides as well. Because of this evidence of success, the Liberals are more or less supportive of these programs. After all, safe injection sites existed under their government. The difference is that the NDP and Greens are much more focused on reducing the harm to users and their families, while the Liberals would like to prioritize the harm faced by communities at large. Which brings us to policing. The Liberals are concerned with increased property crimes and a growing sentiment that the province's homelessness population are more worthy of fear than empathy. And this is a valid concern when citizens don't feel safe on the streets or are finding needles in their children's parks. So, the Liberals will put an additional $58 million into policing to, quote, ensure safer streets and communities. In the face of Black Lives Matter's protests, this might seem a little out of touch, so let's be careful here and really compare. So before Horgan triggered an early election, we were in the middle of reviewing our Police Act. Sonia Furstenau quite likes pointing out that we've needlessly delayed these reforms with this election. But still, both the NDP and Greens are supportive of reviewing and reforming this act. Beyond that, the NDP are a little sparse on details, although I think they hit a lot of the right emotional points when talking about policing and discrimination. The Greens probably do an even better job at that messaging. They're also more clear on what they do about it. The Greens want to seriously rethink the roles and responsibilities of our police forces. They're not anti-policing, but of all three parties, they're the most open to completely replacing a lot of police work with community and social workers. Despite this, though, and despite their iron-fisted messaging, the Liberals have actually laid out the clearest plan for change. So, first of all, they're going to increase the amount of cops. But for every 2 new police officers, they're going to hire 1 new social worker. And of the increased policing, they want more cops to work as unarmed community patrols. Without firearms, this obviously creates a natural incentive for officers to de-escalate situations, rather than resorting to force. The Liberals also want to increase the amount of integrated mobile crisis teams. These already exist under the NDP and are basically teams of social workers, mental health workers, and plainclothes officers who work in unison. And like I said, this already exists under the NDP, and I think if we look back at the NDP and Greens' proactive mental health plans and their commitment to reforming the Police Act, you'll end up with pretty similar outcomes with any party. But it's really clear that as parties, the NDP and Greens have put a lot more thought into the social work side of things, and the Liberals have been much more focused on actual police reforms. So when push comes to shove, they'll prioritize different things. And of course, no conversation about homelessness would be complete without a conversation about housing itself. This is an area where the parties actually differ quite a bit. They all care about affordability, but from very different angles. The NDP is hyper-focused on our most vulnerable citizens, with public and supportive housing, and also care a lot about rentals. The Liberals really don't care about public housing, and instead are really focused on improving the broader market, which affects us all. The Greens are somewhere in the middle. They and the NDP are in favor of a housing-first approach to homelessness. They want to build more housing to get more people off the streets and out of tent cities and create a foothold for people to start building their lives. This method has actually been proven to be cheaper for governments in the long run. The NDP will also create a rent supplement program for people transitioning out of supportive housing to, 1, make sure they're actually improving people's lives and not just warehousing people, as the Liberals like to say the NDP are doing, and 2, to make sure there's always new open spaces for other people who need that housing. Back in 2017, the NDP also promised to build 114,000 units of public housing within 10 years. They definitely haven't been that successful, and at this rate are going to be reaching about half that. Regardless, they are building far more than the previous government did, and this year they're promising the same amount of units for the next 10 years instead. These policies are obviously important if we want to solve the homelessness crisis, which does affect us all. I actually really like the work that the NDP has done here. But most people do not live in supportive housing. They're stuck in the current market with very unaffordable prices. This last term, the NDP did implement the speculation and vacancy taxes to try and decommodify housing and bring existing empty units onto the market. And this did result in a bump in supply, but prices have continued to rise under their watch. The Liberals, on the other hand, who don't have many public housing proposals, have quite a few proposals on this front. The biggest one is to give more provincial funding to municipalities who successfully create new housing. This is a really good incentive and allows different communities to choose their own methods, whether it's zoning or tax cuts or public housing or whatever. We'll also waive public hearings for buildings that are already compliant with community plans, and to account for these changes to communities, they'll also mandate a review of community plans every 5 years. This, I think, is supposed to make it easier for residents to stomach the changes that these new developments will bring to their neighborhoods, because residents will have more control. It also sort of defeats the purpose of a long-term plan, but, the green solution to this, we need more homes versus we don't want change dilemma, is to focus on so-called missing middle housing. These are developments like laneways, townhomes, row homes, so compared to a regular house, they increase the supply in an area, but don't have as big of an effect on community character. Speaking of housing kinds, the Liberals will also make it easier to build accessible housing, so you wouldn't need to climb up or down a staircase to access your door. This is helpful for our aging population especially, and right now is disincentivized by our zoning. On other housing affordability fronts, let's talk about rents, property taxes, and strata insurance. The left-leaning NDP and Greens are obviously much more concerned about renters, and the right-leaning Liberals are much more concerned about property owners. So, the NDP will freeze rental increases until 2022, in the face of the pandemic. After 2022, they'll permanently fix the maximum increase rate to inflation. Right now, this number is set by the government every year, so I think this change is probably good for reliability and personal financial planning of renters and landlords alike. The renting freeze, however, is obviously super helpful for renters, but is the opposite for landlords. For that reason, the Liberals have no such plans. I assume you know which option's best for your situation here. The NDP will also give a $400 tax rebate to renters. The Greens will go much further. Usually, affordability is defined as paying 30% or less of your income on housing. Obviously, most people pay much more than this, so they'll provide a subsidy to close the gap. This would be a super expensive program and would probably help fuel higher prices, so this is really just a very short-term stopgap plan. For property owners, the Liberals would like to fix your property assessment to your current usage, not whatever the land is maximally zoned for. If you're currently living in an area that just got upzoned, this will be really great for you because your property taxes will be lower. But if you're someone in need of more housing supply, on the other hand, this won't do you so good because it subsidizes less efficient land use. Again, I trust you to know your situation here as well. The Greens' plan for property taxes is quite different and is based on a report from the Union of BC Municipalities, which is like an annual congress of mayors and councillors in BC. They'd like to lessen municipalities' reliance on property tax and have cities pay into a province-wide infrastructure bank. With this bank, cities wouldn't need to rely on provincial and federal funding or their own limited tax base or expensive public debt to finance new roads or overpasses or community centers or whatever. Instead, they'd all pay a certain amount of their revenues into the infrastructure bank every year, and whichever community had the most pressing capital project that year would get a reliable and low-risk funding source. I'm willing to bet that some people might not like the share of their taxes going to some other community, but overall, I think this would benefit everyone. And finally for housing, let's talk about strata insurance, and then we'll also take a look at ICBC. So recently, a lot of stratas have become uninsurable, or when they are, the rates have just exploded. To combat this, the NDP are proposing a public insurance company, kind of like ICBC but a little different. Their plan is actually based on recent successes in Saskatchewan, who created a public competitor to private insurance companies and has found success in lowering prices. Interestingly, the Liberals have a very similar proposal for ICBC, but in reverse. You see, after the NDP won in 2017, it was discovered that the previous Liberal government had been improperly using ICBC to help balance its budgets. The result was that ICBC was kind of in shambles, and it became clear that the rates would have to be changed to keep things going. To their credit, the NDP did a pretty good job at this, but the end result, after a few tweaks to what exactly was being insured, was far higher prices for drivers with less experience and just slightly lower prices for people with more experience. This caused quite a bit of outrage. It was an especial burden for young people who were going to school or just starting to build out their careers. Fortunately, these changes seem to have worked, and the NDP is actually even promising future cost cuts. The Liberals, however, who are, remember, responsible for the mess in the first place, would prefer a simpler solution. Right now, there is a mandatory level of insurance which must be bought from the ICBC monopoly. You could then purchase extra insurance, which most people do because the minimum actually only covers other people, from either ICBC or private competitors. The Liberals would like to open everything up to private competition. ICBC would still be in the market to keep the other companies in check and to provide a no-fault alternative to those who wouldn't benefit from a private risk-based system. I think Andrew Wilkinson does a pretty good job articulating this. Anyway, you can see here that just in the same way that the NDP are proposing changes to strata insurance to go from a completely private model to a free market model with an alternative public competitor that can keep the market in check, the Liberals are proposing the same system for auto insurance to go from a semi-monopolized public insurer to a truly free market system that retains a public competitor. I just think it's interesting that they're proposing the same system in different context, and neither chose to carry that logic over to the other market. So whether or not you like this model, you can't vote for both at once. So you have to decide which is more important for you, or alternatively, which one bothers you the least. Alright, now that our riveting conversation about insurance policies is done, let's talk about families, schools, and childcare. So I already talked for a while about Horgan's 2017 promise to bring in $10 a day childcare. If you haven't really been paying attention, it might seem like the NDP went back on this promise, but they're actually just being very careful about the rollout. They don't want any financial scandals to come out of this, so in the last 4 years, they've implemented 50 pilot sites to test the policy, and have been providing $10 a day daycares to some 32,000 families. And now, we're back to even more topics where all three parties are in agreement. The NDP are going to go a little further and build even more than the 22,000 daycares that they promised last election, and plan to implement this program province-wide. The Greens want to go even further and provide free childcare for 3 and 4-year-olds. Basically what they're doing is rolling early education and preschool into our public system. On the gender equality front, they'll 1. Provide $0 a day care for kids under 3 if both parents are working. This makes it easier for mothers to stay in the workforce, which right now is a major barrier to equal wages, even long term. And 2, they'll give $500 a month to stay-at-home parents caring for kids under 3 years old, as part of their apparent love for basic income programs, and to compensate stay-at-home parents for their valuable societal labor that otherwise isn't paid for. Of course, this will be much more expensive than the NDP plan. Speaking of expenses, the Liberals are a little more hesitant here and want to be slightly more fiscally conservative. They'll still follow through on $10 a day daycare, but limit that to lower income families making under $65,000 per year, and then have a slowly increasing scale up to $30 for any family earning $125,000 or more. The NDP and Greens also want to make early childhood educators more like teachers and other professionals, and improve or expand their training and also increase their pay to be more in line with teachers, which is good for those workers. I'm sure they deserve it, but also makes this affordable childcare initiative even more difficult. As far as actual schools go, all parties still mostly agree with each other. They want to further hammer out systems to improve online learning in the face of COVID, and to really improve hybrid models for when some students can't come to class. I'm told right now that this is actually super difficult for teachers and quite ineffective for those online students. And speaking of students dropping out, the Greens want to make sure schools don't lose any funding just because their enrollment numbers are temporarily down this year. Some non-curriculum related things. First of all, I already mentioned the mental health programs that all the parties are in support of. The NDP, since 2017, have also increased the amount of funding for school supplies, so kids can get what they need and classroom supplies are coming less out of teachers' salaries. They've also increased investments in playground upgrades, which is fun. And the NDP and Greens also want to implement meal programs to help kids living in poverty. Moving on to post-secondary, the NDP got rid of interest payments on student loans while those students are still in school. They also waived tuitions for former foster kids, which is like the least we can do for them. The Greens continue to love basic income programs and are proposing income support for foster kids who are aging out of care and just don't have the same familial financial support that lots of other kids do. And the Liberals, again, agree and would like to extend the length of support for foster kids to 25 years of age to meet the realities of young adulthood today. Currently, you age out at 19. Speaking of current realities, the Liberals would like to expand our education system's focus on trades and apprenticeships. They want to streamline the process, increase the amount of apprenticeships in high schools, and generally encourage the kind of good-paying careers that have been neglected over the last few years of STEM infatuation. For other post-secondary programs, they'd like to increase transparency and just make it easier to find out the true tuition costs of programs, which is half possible now, but more difficult than it needs to be. Alright, this is a long video. Let's talk about infrastructure for a bit, and then that'll bleed into conversations about industry and the environment, and then we're almost done. Again, the parties agree on a lot more here than they disagree, but there are a few differences. So for example, the old Liberal government was really into building big infrastructure projects to stimulate the economy and create jobs. They built the new Portman Bridge, the Golden Ears. They were also in power for the Olympics, so they built the new Sea to Sky Highway and the Canada Line. They also started the Site C Dam project. The Liberals just really liked these micro-infrastructure projects that looked good on a provincial level and could be justified for the industry it would create. The NDP, on the other hand, are much more interested in working with local governments, and so choose to prioritize the concerns of the Mayor's Council and other local representatives above everything else. This is why, for example, they chose to divert funds from the Macy Tunnel Replacement Bridge, which the Liberals still want to build, by the way, to the Patello Bridge replacement in New West, because the Mayor's Council wanted that more. They also supported the decision of Surrey's new mayor when he wanted to replace the plans for a light rail in Surrey with a SkyTrain extension from King George to Langley City, and they prioritized funding for the Broadway extension in Vancouver and are even supportive of the gondola to SFU. Somewhat related, they also scrapped bridge tolls, and of course there's some important trade-offs with that. This diverted quite a lot of funds that could have gone elsewhere that now have to pay off the bridge, but it also relieved a pretty serious financial burden for people living in the valley. It also probably won the NDP the election, so there's that. I also think they deserve credit for how quickly they were able to react to Greyhound's departure and create BC bus coach lines. Further, the NDP, as a Labour Party, limited work on these projects to unionized workers. The Liberals, as the Free Enterprise Party, would undo that change. Related to this, the NDP sped up the minimum wage increases, which will be hitting $15 an hour soon. Otherwise, all three parties are mostly in agreement. They all want to expand public transit and increase frequency at peak times through BC ferries. The NDP and Liberals would also widen Highway 1 from Langley to Castle Fun Park to get rid of the weird bottlenecks that are in the middle there. The Greens have a pretty interesting plan to create a unified transit authority for Greater Victoria. This would unify transportation decision-making, which is currently divided between the various municipalities, would give more focus to the needs of the Capital Regional District, and, at the same time, would free up the provincial government to focus less on local issues and more on provincial issues at large. And the last bit of infrastructure-related things we need to talk about before climate change: ride-sharing. So, after years of waiting, both the Liberals and NDP governments took their time to deliberate on services like Uber and Lyft, and then the NDP eventually legalized it. In the meantime, we even got related services like Skip the Dishes and other food delivery outfits. Going forward, the NDP, again as the labor-focused party, are much more focused on regulations for the workers. Meanwhile, the Liberals, as the Free Enterprise Coalition, are much more focused on local businesses. One of the difficulties for these so-called gig workers is that they exist in this weird limbo between contract workers and employees. To partially remedy this, the NDP are going to create a voluntary, province-wide benefit and pension plan so that these workers can keep working these same jobs while also getting the same sorts of benefits that are available to, say, a taxi worker. Another difficulty, related to food delivery specifically, is that businesses are in a bit of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. They lose out on tons of business in a rapidly evolving sector if they don't sell their food through these apps. But the apps, in addition to charging consumers delivery fees, take an additional cut out of restaurants' revenues. So to alleviate this, the Liberals would cap these cuts to 15%. I think the NDP and Liberals both have good, forward-looking policies here, and I support both. I also think they'd be remiss to only implement their plan, and not also adopt their rivals' policies. Speaking of restaurants, all parties want to see the recent patio extensions become permanent, and the BC Liberals, in the face of COVID, would also allow restaurants to use their current liquor licenses to send out drinks for delivery, which is cool. And while we're vaguely on the topic of jobs and COVID-related changes, this seems like a good time to mention that the Greens would also create some sort of incentive to allow for continued telecommuting for at least some days of the week. And a little related, they would also somehow incentivize businesses to adopt profit-sharing models with their employees. Now let's take a look at other kinds of driving and how they relate to climate change, emissions, and the environment. So all three parties agree that we need to reduce our emissions and hit carbon zero within the next 30 years or so. The Greens think we should align ourselves to California's earlier deadline of 2045 rather than Canada's 2050 goal. In order to hit these goals, they also think we should have fixed targets for 2025, which is a much more tangible deadline for a 4-year legislature, compared to our current interim targets of 2030, where we hope to reduce emissions by 40%. Recently, the government froze our annual carbon tax increases, and the Liberals think we should extend these delays as we recover from COVID. The Greens, predictably, do not. Besides the carbon tax, all parties have various schemes to ensure new buildings are more green, old buildings get retrofitted, and we expand our electric car charging stations. The NDP even want to create a right to charge, which would mandate chargers in more stratas, apartments, and offices. All parties want to get our bus fleets to net zero, and recently, the Greens and NDP made BC the first jurisdiction to sign a death warrant for gas cars. Starting in 2040, you'll only be able to buy electric. Though the Greens would like to push this deadline forward a little bit to match up with California's standard again, which is 2035. The Liberals, on the other hand, are the only party who support carbon capture technology, or at least have it in their platforms. A lot of people feel like carbon capture is a bit of a cop-out, and I get that, but realistically, the primary goal is net zero, and this is a great way to pick up some of that slack. In terms of pipelines, both the NDP and Liberals support the LNG pipeline through northern BC, although the NDP did fight a losing court battle to stop the Trans Mountain pipeline. These pipelines are really great, and that will create lots of jobs in the short term, but eventually, of course, this industry is going to die. If that's your sort of thinking, I guess you could say that the Greens are more forward-looking in this regard. They want to stop spending the billions of dollars that the government currently spends to subsidize pipelines and reorient those funds to jobs guarantee for oil workers. They'll start by spending $500 million on income support and job training for the transition of these tradesmen into other industries. Let's move on to another crucial industry for our province, forestry. First of all parties agree that mass timber, big construction projects which use wood instead of concrete, are really great, and they want to support the industry. Besides the benefit of supporting a local industry, mass timber buildings also avoid the incredible amount of emissions that cement mixing and concrete curing creates. Sure, for a while you lose the carbon sink that is the tree, but we can regrow those. Beyond that though, the parties are a little divided on the nuanced balance of logging versus conservation. The Liberals are mostly concerned with industrial sustainability. They want to invest in reforestation to ensure that the industry is operating such a way to ensure that there's always crops of trees to be logged. The NDP are slightly more environmentally focused, recently having placed 353,000 acres of old-growth forest under protection, which is this big. But they've also kickstarted lots of mass timber projects to support the industry, like the new St. Paul's Hospital and the Royal BC Museum expansion. The Greens, predictably, would go even further than the NDP and would outright ban the logging of old-growth trees and would only allow the logging of trees planted more recently. The Greens are also really focused on biodiversity, because right now it's great that BC has tons of forest, but right now, these forests are more like farms than an ecosystem. In addition to this, they'd like to protect our endangered species, like our caribou and mountain goats. Geets? When it comes to industry, the Greens are more focused on the community level. They create revenue-sharing regulations for the benefit of local communities and First Nations, and would ban the export of raw logs, which would probably be pretty inefficient, but would keep BC processors in business. In terms of other protections, both the Liberals and the Greens would not only protect our wetlands, but expand them. Not only does this protect our ecosystems, but it actually also saves costs on sewage and protects against flooding. All parties support protecting our waterways, especially when it comes to protecting and growing the local salmon population. The NDP even, after persistent prodding from activists in the Green Party, recently regulated salmon farming. So now, farm salmon can't be anywhere near wild salmon, which protects them from lice and other diseases that are more common in farm salmon. This process is still in the works, though. In terms of mining and other environmentally risky projects, the NDP would implement this really clever bond system, which would make sure that those operations, even when they go out of business, would pick up the environmental bill rather than taxpayers. The Liberals would go in the opposite direction and would cut permitting time in half, presumably to ease job creation. And finally, the last industry we'll look at, farming. The NDP is focused on educational and financial incentives to get more young workers into the field. Pun intended. The Greens, meanwhile, would focus on food security and independence, and would add that to the mandate of the Agricultural Land Commission. They'd also create a public land bank of agricultural land to cheaply lease to new farmers, which is a little commune-y, but also a good idea, and would regulate foreign ownership of all ALR land. The Liberals, obviously being on the opposite side of political leanings, would deregulate ALR land and allow for a little more construction for dwellings and the like. They'd also create a Trespass Act to protect farmers' work and livelihoods. I'm not a farmer, so I don't know if this is actually a problem, but maybe to you this sounds great. For my part, I thought it was a little funny that they decided to put the Trespass Act as the very first bullet point in their platform following their page on reconciliation and Indigenous land rights, which is what we'll talk about now. So I'm going to start with a general disclaimer about Indian bans and traditional Indigenous governance systems. The NDP and Liberals believe that the consent of the banned governments is the only kind of negotiation they need for infrastructure and resource projects. I couldn't tell precisely where the Greens stood here. Anyway, it's understandable why they would come to that conclusion. After all, the bans are led by hard-working, elected community representatives. But I certainly don't think this is a tact which will result in success. The bans, while elected, are fundamentally illegitimate because they've been imposed by the Canadian government. And further, they've been designed to force nations into financially reliant positions, to force their hands in negotiations. And that's even if they represent their nation at all. Often the bans created by Canada cleave nations, and sometimes even clans or houses of nations, in half. And that's not to say that people working for banned governments are doing bad work, just that any negotiation we come to with them is eventually going to be challenged. If we actually want to create some kind of reliability, to create confidence in our resource and infrastructure sectors, to end the endless conflict and make some progress, this is how we have to approach the problem. Self-governance. Anything else is just a short-term band-aid, because it's going to be seen as illegitimate and will fall apart as soon as the next project rolls around. Anyway, sorry for the rant. We have seen some progress on this front. The NDP and Greens made BC the first government in Canada to turn the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples into law, for example. The only problem is that UNDRIP is quite vaguely worded and open to interpretation, so the Liberals' priority here is to create some certainty for our governance and economy and to really hammer out the details. For the same reason, the NDP would create a dedicated secretariat to manage the input and negotiations that the document requires, although it's still a little fuzzy exactly what that would mean. The Greens, maybe because it aligns with their environmental goals, but I think they are being sincere here, are the most supportive party of input from First Nations. On the short-term versus long-term solution issue I just ranted about, both the NDP and Liberals would like to transition from the sort of short-term transactional contracts we have now and shift towards more long-term, almost constitutional partnerships. Considering we've been working on modern treaties for like 3 decades now in BC, I wouldn't hold on to your hat here, but who knows? On the forced dependence I mentioned earlier, the Liberals are proposing a new system whereby any loans that a band needs would get guaranteed backing from the provincial government. This would allow these smaller bands to get better rates for revenue-generating capital projects. And, in a similar vein, the Greens would like to create energy independence for reserves and create Indigenous-owned utilities. The Greens would further right past wrongs by completely reforming the child welfare system for Indigenous communities. Because even today, the government continues to take Native kids away from their families, communities, and culture because of poverty we've almost forced them into. To fix this, the Greens would give complete control of child welfare to an Indigenous-controlled office, which would ensure these kids can, at best, stay in their homes and, at worst, within their family's community. The Liberals, on the other hand, would actually make the adoption process easier, which I'm sure was designed with great intentions, to make sure every child has a place to call home, a place where they're safe and cared for. And finally, speaking of growing up with their culture, the NDP have invested a lot of money in language revitalization and other cultural programs. They've also thrown their weight behind friendship centers, which I think can best be described as like immigrant cultural community centers, except they cater towards Indigenous cultures. We did it. That was the last section. I know this was all a lot, so let's quickly do a review and sort things out. Let's remember, the parties have a lot in common this election, so I think it's really important for you to personally gauge the parties and leaders on an emotional level. Who do you trust to best and most faithfully implement their platform? Who do you think will prioritize the needs you care about when difficult decisions have to be made? And who do you think will most act in accordance with your values when something new and unexpected, like, I don't know, a global pandemic occurs? And again, there are some minor parties who might win a seat or two, but unless you're looking for a protest vote or you absolutely love the specific candidate, I don't think you should vote for these parties. They're just not big enough players. Back to policies, let's go from the top. All the parties are pretty much in agreement on how to handle COVID itself, so no reason to decide your vote there. As far as financial benefits go, if you remember, the NDP and Greens are much more interested in direct financial contributions to you and your family. The Liberals are more focused on creating jobs through infrastructure projects, although, as we saw, all the parties will be investing in these sorts of projects. So the real decision is, would you prefer a check in the mail or no sales taxes on your purchases for a year? If you chose check in the mail, do you want the BC NDP plan for a one-time big check for most people, or the Green plan of a smaller, reliable monthly income program for people with low to no income? Moving on, all parties are in agreement on helping businesses pay their leases, and they're all concerned with getting all of our industries back on track. And they also agree about the healthcare response to COVID, although the Liberals are the only party to support free flu shots in addition to the eventually free COVID vaccine. As far as hospitals and healthcare go, all the parties like the NDP's work on building new hospitals and reducing wait times, and would do more or less the same thing. The Liberals would also focus on rural ambulance services, so that might be important to you too. As far as seniors go, all parties are in support of more services, especially at-home care. The main difference, remember, was whether or not you think we should switch to a completely public model, like the NDP, a public or non-profit model, like the Greens, or if we should keep our private model, but just regulate it a little more, like the Liberals. And finally for healthcare, the NDP and Greens are the party to vote for if you want to see universal pharmacare, although that depends on federal support too. As for mental health, all parties support making services more accessible, especially in schools. The NDP would even reopen places like Riverview. There are a few nuances here, but I think this really comes down to how much you care about this topic and how much you trust the parties to do the work. On the opioid crisis and addiction, the NDP and Greens are all in on harm reduction. They want to stop deaths with decriminalization and more safe injection sites. Empathy is their guiding principle here. The Liberals aren't necessarily against this, but their main growing concern right now isn't the safety of people using drugs, but the safety of the communities. So, on policing and police reform, all parties support ramping up our social work and mental health services to take on some of the work that police are doing right now. The Liberals, though, because of their homelessness concerns, are the most open to more funding and more cops, although many of them would be unarmed. The Greens are most open to moving police funding to other services and rethinking the scope of what we want police officers' role to be, and the NDP are somewhere in the middle. On housing, the NDP and Greens are most focused on supportive and public housing, as well as renters, while the Liberals are most focused on market prices and property owners. There's a lot of nuance and detail here, so I recommend you go back and watch that section, but that's the general gist. On childcare, all parties are supportive of the NDP's $10 a day childcare pilots and expansions. The Liberals, though, are a little more hesitant on the cost front and would add some means testing, so if your household makes more money in a year, you'd be paying up to $30. The Greens would do the opposite and make preschool age care free and provide benefits for stay-at-home parents and working parents. For schools, all the parties' plans are more or less the same. The NDP and Greens would implement a meal plan, and the NDP have been increasing funding for school supplies and playgrounds, and the Liberals would like more focus on trades, jobs, and apprenticeships for post-secondary. On infrastructure, the parties are mostly on the same page. The Liberals would restart the Macy Tunnel Replacement Bridge project, and probably one of their biggest policies, they would allow for more private competition for auto insurance. They'd leave ICBC in place for those who need it and to keep the market in check, but if you'd rather go somewhere else, you'd be free to do so. The NDP are super supportive of local governments and their planning and transit, especially the Mayor's Council in Metro Vancouver. They've gone all in on new rapid transit projects, which all parties now support, and got rid of bridge tolls. And finally, the Greens would like to create something like the Mayor's Council or even TransLink in Greater Victoria. The NDP and Liberals support widening Highway 1 and the LNG pipeline, while the Greens don't support either for environmental reasons. Instead, they'd use that money for an income and jobs guarantee to help oil and gas workers transition to a new trade. And more on climate, all the parties want to meet our emissions targets. The Liberals are more open to slowing down the carbon tax in the midst of COVID, while the Greens would like to ramp up our targets. All the parties are in support of our lumber industry, especially to start building mass timber towers. The NDP, and especially the Greens, care more about biodiversity in our forests, while the Liberals think of forests more like a crop business. That same thinking applies to all of our other resource industries. Notably, the NDP would create a bond program to make sure natural resource projects would be on the hook for environmental cleanup costs, even if they go out of business. And the Liberals and Greens support protecting and expanding wetlands. As far as the gig economy goes, the NDP are predictably focused on labor and workers' benefits, while the Liberals are more focused on the effects of small businesses like restaurants. And finally, on reconciliation, all the parties would like to move forward to more long-term, reliable agreements rather than short-term contracts. The NDP made the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples law, and the Liberals are worried about clarifying exactly how that would work. The NDP have also done a lot on language revitalization and cultural funding, while the Greens are focused on righting a lot of past wrongs. They'd transfer control of child welfare to Indigenous groups and try to increase energy and wealth independence. And that's everything. Again, there's a lot more agreement than disagreement here. Where the parties do differ, it's usually in pretty predictable ways. The NDP are a lot more supportive of social programs like childcare and social housing than the previous Liberal government. The current Liberals, though, have come around to support a lot of these new NDP projects, but overall are more focused on helping people through tax and cost cuts, like the sales tax and ICBC. Compared to the NDP and Greens, they're a lot more focused on the middle and upper class range, while the NDP is almost entirely focused on lower and working classes, especially in housing. As for the Greens, they're predictably a lot more all-in on environmental protections and speeding up our climate targets. On the social and economic front, they'd actually expand the NDP's programs even more. They're especially fond of income programs and co-ops. They probably won't win enough seats to implement these major expansions, so if you're voting for them here, it's more so they can act as a strong opposition voice for these issues. Alright, I know this was a long one. I'm sorry I'm a little late. I hope it was worth it though, and it all makes sense. If you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate it if you'd share this video with friends and family, ring the like button, smash the subscribe bell, and give me your social insurance number and mother's maiden name on Patreon. And if you're a long-term viewer, or even a former Patreon supporter, that municipality region map tour video I promised a long time ago will be coming out soon. I'm also working on a multi-hour history series for Vancouver and BC, and didn't want to release that municipality video too soon and miss out on any fun facts that I could include. Anyway, thanks for watching.